In the shadowed underbelly of early 20th century America, where the clamor of New York's vibrant streets masked unspeakable horrors, there lurked a predator unlike any other. He was no hulking brute or shadowy phantom of the night. No, this monster wore the guise of a kindly grandfather, a frail, silver-haired house painter with a gentle smile and twinkling eyes that belied the abyss within. His name was Hamilton Howard Albert Fish, but to those who whispered his legacy in terror, he was the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac, the Boogeyman. This is the story of a man who turned innocence into nightmare, who feasted on the forbidden, and whose depravity would etch itself into the annals of criminal history as one of the most grotesque tales ever told. Over the next hour, we will journey through the twisted corridors of Albert Fish's mind, from his fractured beginnings to the electric chair that finally silenced his demons. Viewer discretion is advised. What follows is not for the faint of heart. To understand the monster, we must first peer into the cradle of chaos that birthed him. Albert Fish entered the world on May 19, 1870 in Washington, D.C. as Hamilton Howard Fish, the youngest of 4 children born to Randall Fish, a Scottish-American descendant and Civil War veteran turned Potomac River Potables inspector, and Ellen Frances Howell, a woman of Irish-American roots. The Fish family traced its lineage back to colonial times, with distant ties to wealth and influence. But by the time young Hamilton arrived, fortune had turned sour. Randall Fish was 55 when his son was born, a man already ravaged by heart disease, his body a vessel cracked by years of service and strain. Ellen, just 31, toiled as a seamstress, her hands calloused from endless needlework. Life in the nation's capital was a grind of poverty and peril, with the echoes of post-war reconstruction still reverberating through the streets. But the true unraveling began when Hamilton was just 5 years old. On August 15, 1875, Randall succumbed to a heart attack, leaving Ellen a widow at 36, burdened with 4 young mouths to feed in an era when a woman's prospects were as dim as a gas lamp in fog. Desperation clawed at Ellen's resolve. With no safety net, she made a heart-wrenching choice: to commit her son to the care of the New York House of Refuge, an orphanage on Randall's Island in the East River. It was meant to be temporary, a place where the boy could receive food, shelter, and rudimentary education while she scraped together a living. But for 5-year-old Hamilton, it became a crucible of cruelty. The House of Refuge was no sanctuary. Founded in 1825 as a reformatory for wayward youth, it was a grim fortress of discipline and despair, where rehabilitation often meant brutality. Older boys ruled the roost, their fists and whims unchecked by overburdened staff. Hamilton, small and unassuming, became a target. Bullied relentlessly, he endured beatings that left welts and scars, both visible and invisible. But it was the orchestrated punishments that scarred him deepest. The boys fashioned paddles from wood, embedding nails and tacks into the striking surfaces. They took turns flogging one another, and Hamilton learned early to crave the pain. As he later confessed in fragmented whispers to psychiatrists, the lashings stirred something primal within him, a rush of endorphins that blurred into ecstasy. "I got an erection," he would say flatly, as if recounting the weather. "It was the only pleasure I ever knew." From these shadows emerged the seeds of sadomasochism, a perversion that would fester and bloom into horrors unimaginable. Hamilton also adopted a new name during his time there, Albert, after a deceased relative, to shed the mocking nickname Ham and Eggs, bestowed by his tormentors. It was a small rebellion, but one that stuck for life. Ellen reclaimed her son when he was 10, securing work as a house servant. By then, the damage was done. Albert returned to a fractured family, his siblings scattered, his mother's affection strained. He attended public school fitfully, excelling in nothing but mischief. At 12, a pivotal encounter sealed his descent. While visiting relatives in Pennsylvania, he became fixated on a young boy who bragged of sticking himself with pins for thrills. Albert tried it himself, piercing his perineum in secret. The act ignited a compulsion. Over the years, he would embed dozens, perhaps hundreds, of needles into his groin and pelvis, deriving a twisted gratification from the agony. X-rays taken later in life revealed a grotesque mosaic. Over 24 rusting pins lodged deep in his flesh, some broken off, others clustered like barbs in a fisherman's lure. By his late teens, Albert Fish had drifted into the undercurrents of American life. At 20, in 1890, he found work as a house painter in New York City, a trade that would sustain him for decades, allowing him to blend seamlessly into neighborhoods from Brooklyn to the Bronx. The city was a cauldron of opportunity and vice, its tenements teeming with immigrants and the dispossessed. Fish married Anna Mary Hoffman in 1898, a woman 9 years his junior, in a union arranged by his mother. They settled in Harlem, and over the next decade, 6 children arrived: Albert Jr., Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry. To the world, Fish was the picture of domesticity, a mild-mannered provider who doted on his brood with quiet affection, but behind closed doors, the facade cracked. Anna, restless in her role, began an affair with a handyman. The marriage dissolved in acrimony by 1917, leaving Fish a single father. He relocated the family to a modest home at 393 East 52nd Street in Brooklyn. But the children bore witness to their father's unraveling. He fashioned a nail-studded paddle, much like those from his orphanage days, and commanded them to flog him. "Hit me harder," he'd urge, his voice a mix of plea and command. They obeyed, horrified, yet compelled. As welts rose on his back like crimson maps of madness, Fish's perversions extended beyond self-inflicted pain. He devoured forbidden literature, crowdsourcing tales of sexual deviance from pulp magazines and medical texts, coprophagia, urolagnia, pederasty. He explored them all, often with unwitting accomplices. By the 1910s, he was a fixture in New York's seedy underbelly, posing as a benevolent uncle to lure vulnerable boys. His first known assault came around 1910, on a young lad he met in the streets. Fish sodomized him, then fled. It was the spark of a lifelong hunt. Criminal dalliances dotted his record. In 1903, he served time in Sing Sing for grand larceny, stealing farm equipment under a false name. Released in 1905, he was nabbed again for sending obscene letters to women, his prose a fevered blend of lust and lunacy. Paroled in 1908, Fish evaded serious scrutiny for years, his unassuming demeanor a perfect camouflage. But as World War I raged and Prohibition dawned, the Great War's end in 1918 unleashed something feral in him. The bloodlust, as he called it, had awakened. The 1920s dawned on America like a golden mirage, the Jazz Age, a whirlwind of flappers, speakeasies, and roaring excess. But for the forgotten in urban slums, it was an era of quiet desperation. Children played in alleys, hawking newspapers or scavenging for scraps, their laughter a fragile shield against the grind. It was into this world that Albert Fish, now in his 50s, inserted himself as a wolf in grandfather's clothing. His method was methodical, chilling in its banality. Fish scoured classified ads in the New York World and Evening Telegram, ads from families seeking work for their sons. He'd respond as Frank Howard, a prosperous farmer from upstate promising jobs on his farm in Worcester. His letters were warm, paternal. "I have a position in my home for a strong boy, good pay, room and board." Desperate parents, blinded by hope, welcomed the silver-haired stranger into their homes. Tea was poured, pleasantries exchanged. And then, the hook? My sister and I are hosting a party for the niece of a dear friend. Would your little girl like to come? It's just a short train ride. The first confirmed victim was 4-year-old Billy Gaffney, snatched from his Brooklyn stoop on March 25, 1924. Witnesses saw a gray-haired man chatting amiably with the boy before they vanished together. Billy's mother, Anna, searched frantically, plastering posters across the boroughs. Police dragged the East River for days, but the trail went cold. 6 months later, on July 14, 1924, fish struck again. 8-year-old Francis McDonnell, playing on his Long Island estate, was lured away with promises of candy. His body turned up the next day, mutilated in a nearby woodshed, strangled, sodomized, and partially devoured. Fish had filleted flesh from the boy's cheeks and abdomen, savoring the tender cuts, as he confessed later. Authorities puzzled over the savagery, dubbing it the work of a vampire. But it was the third crime that would unmask him, a masterpiece of deception that shattered a family and a city. On May 25, 1928, 18-year-old Edward Budd placed an ad in the Sunday edition of the New York World. Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Fish, ever the opportunist, replied as Frank Howard, enclosing a crisp dollar bill for the reply. He arrived at the Budd family's cramped apartment at 922 Thomas Street in Manhattan on a sweltering Saturday afternoon, impeccably dressed in a gray suit, carrying a basket of strawberries as a gift. Edward answered the door, introducing his parents, Albert Sr. and Delia, and his younger siblings, including 10-year-old Grace, a bright-eyed girl with ribbons in her hair. Fish charmed them effortlessly. Over tea and cake, he spun yarns of his farm in Westchester, the fresh air and bountiful harvests. "I'm celebrating my little niece's birthday tomorrow," he said with a wink. "She's turning 9, just like your Grace. Why not let her come along? The train ride will be an adventure. She can meet my sister and all the children." Delia hesitated, but Fish's eyes twinkled with avuncular warmth. Edward vouched for the kindly old man. Grace, thrilled at the prospect, hugged her mother goodbye. Fish promised to return her by evening. They departed at 3:15 p.m., hand in hand, like any doting uncle and niece. Edward watched them board the subway at 59th Street. That was the last anyone saw of Grace Budd alive. Panic engulfed the Budd home by nightfall. Edward scoured the streets, Delia collapsed in hysterics, and Albert Sr. notified police at once. The story exploded across front pages. Missing girl, 10-year-old lured by stranger. Detectives fanned out, interviewing neighbors, chasing leads from Coney Island to Central Park. Rewards poured in. $500 from the New York Evening Graphic, more from anonymous donors. The city, still reeling from the Lindbergh baby kidnapping scare just months earlier, buzzed with fear. "Protect your children," blared headlines. Parents locked doors that had once swung wide. Weeks turned to months. Tips flooded in. A girl matching Grace's description spotted in Philadelphia, another in Atlantic City. But each trail evaporated like mist. Fish, meanwhile, retreated to a secluded cottage at 37 Minthorn Road in Wisteria, Long Island, a ramshackle haven amid orchards and woods, perfect for his rituals. There, on that fateful Sunday, he had led Grace not to a party, but to perdition. He strangled her gently at first, kneeling on her chest until her struggles ceased. Then, with a hacksaw procured from his painter's kit, he decapitated her. The body was sectioned methodically, thighs roasted with bacon and onions, buttocks stewed in butter. The rest boiled into a broth he savored over 9 days. "It was the sweetest flesh I ever tasted," he would write later, without remorse. Grace's remnants were buried in the woods, her skull crushed and discarded in the Hudson River. For 6 years, the case languished, a cold file in the NYPD's Missing Persons Bureau. Fish, emboldened, continued his predations. He molested dozens more, sending taunting postcards to families. "Your boy is safe with me," one read, unsigned. But hubris, that fatal flaw of the wicked, would be his undoing. November 1934, the Budd family, hollowed by grief, had all but surrendered to despair. Delia, now a spectral figure haunting her kitchen, was sorting mail when a plain envelope caught her eye, postmarked from Brooklyn, no return address. Inside was a letter penned in spidery script on cheap stationery. What she read froze her blood. "My dear Mrs. Budd," it began. "In 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand. He told me so many boys were castrated that I took a 14-year-old boy here for a room and castrated him. He was next to me on the operating table. The bloodlust seized me. I cut off his ears, nose, opened his mouth and cut off his tongue, then took off his genitals. I made him roast them and eat them." The ramblings escalated, a torrent of depravity, tales of self-torture, of voices from God commanding him to be as Christ and sacrifice the young. Then the gut punch. "I took the girl, Mrs. Budd, and brought her to an empty house. She died a virgin. I ate her." Delia fainted. Revived, she stumbled to the police, letter clutched like a talisman. Detectives, skeptical at first, were horrified. The stationery, pilfered from a Manhattan rooming house, was traced via a janitor's tip. The landlady identified Howard as a recent tenant, Albert Fish, who had vacated just days prior. On December 13, 1934, two detectives, William King and John Stein, cornered Fish at his daughter Anna's home in White Plains. He feigned surprise, but when pressed, his mask slipped. "Bring me to the chair," he murmured, eyes gleaming. "I will go quietly." In custody, Fish confessed with chilling candor, Grace Budd was just the appetizer. He claimed 3 murders, Billy Gaffney, Francis McDonnell, and Grace, but boasted of a child in every state, tallying up to 100 victims. Police linked him to unsolved cases: the 1927 disappearance of little Mary Cotter from Staten Island, the 1928 vanishing of 4-year-old Emma Richardson. Exhumations confirmed his handiwork, partial remains matching his described methods. But the true horror lay in his psyche. Psychiatrists examined him for weeks. There was no perversion he did not practice, one noted, and frequently. The trial of the century convened on January 15, 1935, in the Westchester County Courthouse in White Plains, a squat brick edifice that strained under the weight of public fury. Prosecutor Elbert T. Gallagher, a bulldog of a man, framed Fish as a calculating fiend, not a madman. "This defendant is a psychopathic personality without psychosis," Gallagher thundered, quoting experts, "sane as you or I." The letter to Delia became Exhibit A, its cannibalistic confessions read aloud to gasps from the gallery. Jurors, 12 ordinary men, fathers among them, averted their eyes as photos of Grace's bloodied frock were passed. Defense attorneys James Dempsey and Frank J. Mahoney pleaded insanity. They paraded a parade of alienists. Dr. Frederick Wortham, famed for his work on comic book violence, diagnosed Fish with religious psychosis, claiming divine voices drove the killings. X-rays of the needle-riddled pelvis were projected, eliciting murmurs of revulsion. Fish himself took the stand, his voice a monotone dirge. "God told me to do it," he droned, "to suffer as Christ suffered." He detailed the orphanage beatings, the pins, the escalating urges. "I stuck the first one in when I was 12. It felt good." Dempsey pressed, "Did you hear voices?" Fish nodded. halting and stuttering, but clear as day. The prosecution countered brutally. Witnesses testified to Fish's lucid charm, the farmer's tales, the strawberry basket. He knew right from wrong, Gallagher insisted. He chose the dark. After 10 days of testimony, the jury deliberated just 4 hours. Guilty on all counts, kidnapping and first-degree murder. No insanity. Sentence, death. Fish smiled faintly as the verdict rang out. Not a big surprise, he quipped to reporters. Appeals dragged into 1935. A plea to Governor Herbert Lehman, petition citing Wortham's findings. All denied. On January 16, 1936, under a slate-gray sky, Fish was led to Sing Sing Prison's death house in Ossining. The big house, with its yellow brick walls and electric chair dubbed Old Sparky, had claimed 500 souls since 1891. Fish spent his final hours scribbling notes for the press, confessions never released, locked away by his lawyer. At 11:06 p.m., guards strapped him in. Witnesses noted his calm, almost euphoric demeanor. As 2,000 volts coursed through him, rumors swirled. Fish achieved orgasm in the chair, his final perversion. The autopsy confirmed the needles, 29 in all, some corroded to his bones. He was 65, buried unmarked in the prison cemetery, his grave a pauper's plot. Albert Fish's shadow lingers, a cautionary specter in the gallery of American monsters. He claimed 3 lives on record, but whispers persist of dozens more, ghosts in the machine of unsolved cases from the Roaring '20s. His crimes birthed tabloid frenzy, fueling the era's obsession with vampire killers and stranger danger. Parents clutched children closer. Laws on child welfare tightened. Yet Fish endures not just as villain, but as enigma. Was he forged in the orphanage's fire, a product of nurture's neglect? Or did some genetic glitch, his family's history of mental frailty, predestine the descent? Psychologists today dissect him through lenses of paraphilia and trauma, sadomasochism intertwined with religious mania, coprophilia laced with cannibalistic urges. The most degenerate human I've encountered, Wortham wrote, but labels fall short. Fish was the abyss staring back, a reminder that evil often arrives not with horns, but in a gray suit bearing strawberries. In the end, as the electric hum faded at Sing Sing, so did the gray man. But his story? It echoes still. In the locked diaries of criminologists, the cautionary reels of true crime, the nightmares of those who dare to listen. Grace Budd's laughter, Billy Gaffney's games, Francis McDonald's innocence. They were stolen, but not forgotten. We remember to honor the lost, to guard the vulnerable, and to question the masks we all wear. For more untold stories from the dark side of history, subscribe and turn on notifications. Sleep tight and lock your doors.